Everyone knows the story. The Dutch bought Manhattan for $24 worth of beads. History's greatest real estate swindle. Except that's not what happened. The truth involves two completely different concepts of ownership. A deal that may never have been legal, and indigenous people who played the Dutch like fools. This is the real story of Manhattan's sale and who actually got cheated. Long before it became the most expensive real estate on Earth, Manhattan was called Mannahatta, Island of Many Hills in the Lenape language. For over 10,000 years, the Lenape people had lived on and around this island. They weren't a single tribe, but a collection of autonomous bands sharing language, culture, and kinship. The Canarsie controlled much of present-day Brooklyn. The Wet'suwet'en lived in the Bronx and northern Manhattan. The Rekiwawank inhabited Upper Manhattan. Others moved seasonally across the island. Mannahatta in 1600 would be unrecognizable today. Dense forests of chestnut, oak, and hickory covered the island. Over 66 miles of streams ran through it. Freshwater ponds dotted the landscape. At the southern tip, where Wall Street now stands, was bordered by marshes and oyster reefs. Wildlife thrived in abundance. Black bears roamed the forests. Wolves hunted deer. Beavers built dams in every stream. The waters teemed with oysters so large that early European visitors complained they were difficult to eat. Sturgeon ran 12 feet long in the rivers. Passenger pigeons flew overhead in flocks so massive they darkened the sky. The Lenape lived within this ecosystem, not separate from it. They practiced sophisticated forest management, using controlled burns to clear underbrush and create meadows that attracted deer. They cultivated the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash in cleared fields during the summer months. But they didn't live in permanent year-round settlements on Manhattan. Their society followed seasonal rounds. Spring meant fishing camps along the rivers where shad and sturgeon ran. Summer brought them to planting fields. Fall was for harvesting and hunting. Winter camps were established in protected valleys. This mobility was intentional, sustainable. It allowed the land to recover, prevented resource depletion, and maintained ecological balance. Different bands might use the same territory at different times of year, overlapping without conflict because land wasn't owned. It was shared, used, respected. The Lenape had complex governance systems. Decisions were made through councils where consensus was required. Leaders, called sachems, held authority through wisdom and generosity, not force. Women held significant power. They controlled agriculture, selected chiefs, and could remove them. Their economy was sophisticated. They produced wampum, beads carved from shellfish that served as both ceremonial objects and currency. Trade networks stretched from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. Manhattan, situated at the mouth of the Hudson River, was a crucial trading hub. The Lenape knew Europeans before Europeans discovered them. By 1600, they'd encountered fishing vessels, traded furs for metal goods, heard stories of pale-skinned people from the East. Some had likely contracted European diseases, minor outbreaks that hinted at catastrophes to come. Then, on September 2, 1609, a ship appeared in the lower bay. The Half Moon, captained by Henry Hudson, an Englishman sailing for the Dutch East India Company. Hudson was searching for the Northwest Passage to Asia. He'd failed to find it through the Arctic and now tried a more southerly route. He sailed into the harbor up the river that would bear his name. The Lenape watched from shore. Some paddled out in canoes to trade. Initial encounters were friendly, exchanges of furs for knives, blades, and cloth. But tensions arose quickly. Some of Hudson's crew went ashore and ransacked indigenous graves. The Lenape retaliated, killing one sailor with an arrow. Hudson's men responded with musket fire, killing several Lenape. It was a preview of centuries to come. Trade and violence, cooperation and conflict, mutual benefit and mutual destruction. Hudson sailed away after 3 weeks, but his report sparked Dutch interest. The river was navigable. The natives had furs. The land was fertile. This could be profitable. Within a year, Dutch merchants were sending ships to trade. By 1614, they'd established Fort Nassau near present-day Albany. The fur trade exploded. Beaver pelts, virtually extinct in Europe, commanded astronomical prices. A single pelt could buy a musket. A bundle could buy a farm. The Lenape found themselves at the center of an economic revolution. Metal tools transformed their work. A steel axe could fell trees 10 times faster than stone tools. Iron kettles replaced ceramic pots. Cloth provided warmth without hours of hide preparation. But these goods came with invisible costs. Trade created dependencies. European diseases began spreading. Competition for fur-bearing territories intensified conflicts between indigenous groups, and the Europeans wanted more than trade. They wanted land. The Lenape had no framework for understanding what was coming. In their worldview, land was like air or sunlight, essential, shared, impossible to possess exclusively. You could have rights to use land to hunt or fish or plant in certain areas, but owning land forever. Selling it like a basket or a pot. The concept was absurd. They would soon learn that Europeans had very different ideas, and those ideas would be backed by guns, laws, and pieces of paper that claimed to transform the immortal earth into property. By 1624, the Dutch West India Company established New Netherland as a formal colony. They built Fort Amsterdam on Manhattan's southern tip. 30 families arrived to create a permanent settlement. The Dutch needed indigenous cooperation. They were outnumbered, vulnerable, and depended on native food supplies and knowledge. But they also needed something else, a legal claim that other Europeans would recognize. And that meant they needed to buy Manhattan. The Dutch came to North America for one reason: money. Unlike the Spanish conquistadors seeking gold or English Puritans seeking religious freedom, the Dutch were businessmen. The Dutch Republic in the early 1600s was Europe's commercial superpower. Amsterdam was the continent's financial capital. Dutch ships dominated global trade. And in 1621, a group of wealthy merchants formed the Dutch West India Company, a corporation granted monopoly rights to trade and colonize in the Americas. This wasn't a government expedition. It was a business venture. The company had its own military, its own laws, its own authority to make treaties and wage war. Its shareholders expected profits, not profits. The key to those profits was fur, specifically beaver fur. European fashion in the 1600s demanded felt hats. The best felt came from beaver fur, whose microscopic barbs created superior binding. But European beavers were nearly extinct, hunted out centuries earlier. North American beavers, with thicker pelts from colder climates, were even more valuable. A single beaver pelt purchased from indigenous traders for a knife worth 1 guilder could sell in Amsterdam for 20 guilders. The profit margins were extraordinary. The Dutch quickly realized Manhattan's strategic importance. It sat at the mouth of the Hudson River, a highway into the interior where millions of beavers lived. It had the best natural harbor on the eastern seaboard. It was defensible, surrounded by water. In 1625, the company sent Willem Verhulst as director of New Netherland with explicit instructions: establish a permanent base on Manhattan. Fort Amsterdam was constructed on the southern tip, a simple structure of earthen walls and wooden palisades. Around it, 30 families built homes. These weren't idealistic colonists, but company employees sent to facilitate trade. The settlement was tiny, vulnerable. Maybe 200 Dutch people on an island surrounded by thousands of Lenape. The colonists needed indigenous peoples for everything: food, furs, geographical knowledge, and protection from hostile tribes. Relations were transactional but peaceful. The Lenape brought beaver pelts, deer hides, and corn. The Dutch provided metal tools, cloth, and firearms. Though selling guns to natives was officially prohibited, it happened constantly. But the Dutch faced a problem: legitimacy. Other European powers were eyeing the same territory. The English had settlements in Virginia and were establishing footholds in New England. The French controlled the St. Lawrence River. The Swedes were planning colonies on the Delaware. Under European international law, discovery alone didn't grant ownership. You needed effective occupation, permanent settlements, and ideally, purchase from native inhabitants. A deed, a treaty, something on paper that other European powers would recognize. The company's directors in Amsterdam sent clear instructions to their colonial administrators: acquire legal title to Manhattan. Make it indisputable. This created a bizarre situation. The Dutch needed to impose their concept of property ownership on people who had no such concept. They needed the Lenape to sell something the Lenape didn't believe could be sold. It would be like someone today trying to buy the wind. How do you purchase something that, in your worldview, cannot be owned? The Lenape, meanwhile, had their own interests. The Dutch presence was useful. Goods improved daily life dramatically. Dutch military power could be leveraged against enemies. The Lenape had long-standing conflicts with the Mohawk to the north and Susquehannock to the south. Different Lenape bands competed for Dutch trade. Whoever controlled access to Fort Amsterdam controlled access to European goods. This created jealousies, rivalries, and strategic maneuvering among indigenous groups. Some Lenape bands saw an opportunity in Dutch land hunger. If the strangers wanted to give valuable goods for permission to use land the Lenape would use anyway, why not take the deal? Especially if you could make the same deal multiple times with different European groups. The Lenape had been managing competing territorial claims for generations. Multiple bands might have rights to the same hunting ground or fishing spot used at different seasons or for different purposes. They were experts at negotiating overlapping use rights. The Dutch thought in terms of exclusive ownership. The Lenape thought in terms of a shared use. Neither side fully understood the other's perspective. This misunderstanding would shape what happened next. Peter Minuit arrived as Director General of New Netherland on May 4, 1626. He was a Walloon, a French-speaking Protestant refugee who'd risen through the Dutch commercial world. He was pragmatic, profit-focused, and determined to secure Manhattan permanently. Within weeks of arriving, Minuit began negotiating with local indigenous groups for the island's purchase. But which groups? Who had the authority to sell Manhattan? Different bands had different claims. The Wet'suwet'en controlled the northern parts. The Rikawawonk had villages on the eastern shore. The Canarsie from Brooklyn had fishing camps on the southern tip. Minuit may not have cared about these distinctions. He needed a transaction, any transaction, that report to Amsterdam as a legal purchase. What followed would become the most famous real estate deal in history, and also one of the most misunderstood. Because the question isn't just what the Dutch paid for Manhattan. It's whether they actually bought it at all. The document that would supposedly transfer ownership of 23 square miles of the Earth's surface from one person to another was about to be created. Or was it? Because here's the thing about the most famous land purchase in history. The deed has never been found. Peter Minuit had been Director General of New Netherland for exactly 20 days when he made the deal that would define his place in history. He was 46 years old, experienced in colonial administration, and facing an immediate crisis. The Dutch West India Company's investment in New Netherland was hemorrhaging money. Ships, supplies, salaries, the costs were enormous. The fur trade was profitable but unstable. Shareholders in Amsterdam were asking hard questions. Minuit needed to show progress. Real, tangible, legally defensible progress. The company had given him explicit instructions before he sailed. Secure a clear title to Manhattan Island. Make it legally ironclad. Create documentation that would stand up in European courts if challenged by England or France. This wasn't paranoia. It was precedent. The English and Dutch were already disputing territory in Connecticut. The French claimed the entire St. Lawrence watershed. The Swedes were planning settlements on the Delaware. Everyone knew North America was up for grabs, and whoever had the best legal claims, backed by military force, would win. Under the European law of nations, there were 3 ways to claim territory: discovery, conquest, or purchase. Discovery was weak. Multiple nations could claim to have discovered the same land. Conquest was expensive and created ongoing resistance. Purchase was ideal. It provided moral and legal legitimacy, but a purchase required a seller. And that's where Minuit's problem became complex. The Lenape who lived around Manhattan didn't have a single leader who could sell the island. They had sachems, chiefs, but these leaders ruled by consensus, not decree. No individual could unilaterally transfer land rights. Moreover, different Lenape bands had different types of claims to Manhattan. Some had permanent villages, others had seasonal camps, some had hunting rights, others had fishing rights. These uses overlapped in complex ways that had been negotiated over generations. Minuit either didn't understand these complexities or didn't care. He needed a transaction, a piece of paper, something to send back to Amsterdam. The exact sequence of events in May 1626 is murky. We don't have Minuit's diary or detailed Dutch records. What we know comes from a single letter written by Pieter Janszoon Schegen, a Dutch merchant, to the States General, the Dutch Parliament, later that year. The letter, dated November 5, 1626, contains one crucial sentence. They have purchased the island Manhatts from the Indians for the value of 60 guilders. That's it. No details about who they specifically were, presumably Minuit and his agents. No identification of which Indians were involved. No description of what goods comprised the 60 guilders' value. No map of what was included in the island Manhattan. This single sentence is the only contemporary evidence that a purchase took place, but based on later events and documents, we can reconstruct what likely happened. Minuit probably dealt with the Canarsie band, who controlled western Long Island, modern Brooklyn, but also had some presence on lower Manhattan. The Canarsie sachems may have had the authority to grant the Dutch use rights to their fishing camps and seasonal stops on Manhattan. True. From the Canarsie perspective, this was a familiar transaction. European traders wanted permission to build a fort and trading post. In exchange, they'd provide valuable goods. The Canarsie would retain their access to the island while gaining a powerful trading partner. It was basically a rental agreement with a large security deposit. Minuit, however, believed he was purchasing permanent, exclusive ownership of the entire island. In his mind, the transaction would transfer sovereignty from the Lenape to the Dutch West India Company forever. The payment of 60 guilders worth of trade goods wasn't cash. The Lenape had no use for European money. It was practical items, iron axes, hoes, awls for drilling, knives, kettles, and cloth. Possibly some wampum beads, though these were indigenous made, and the Dutch would have been buying them from natives to trade back to natives. No contemporary source mentions the infamous beads that later became part of the legend. That detail was added by 19th century writers who wanted to make indigenous people seem more primitive and gullible. 60 guilders in 1626 was not a trivial sum. A Dutch soldier earned about 60 guilders per year. A small house in Amsterdam costs around 300 guilders. The trade goods, in terms of their utility to the Lenape, were even more valuable, metal tools that would last generations and transform daily work. But here's the crucial point. There's no evidence that both sides understood the transaction the same way. The Dutch believed they had purchased absolute ownership. The Lenape believed they had granted use rights while retaining their own access. The Dutch thought the deal was permanent. The Lenape thought it was renewable. The Dutch thought it covered all of Manhattan. The Lenape thought it covered specific areas. These misunderstandings were compounded by language barriers. Negotiations happened through interpreters who may not have fully understood either culture's concept of property. Key terms like ownership, sale, and forever may have had no equivalent in Lenape languages. Minuit didn't care about these subtleties. He had what he needed, a transaction he could call a purchase. He immediately sent word to Amsterdam that Manhattan had been legally acquired. The company directors were satisfied. The investment was secured. The colony had legitimacy. But almost immediately, cracks appeared in this legal foundation. Other Lenape bands, particularly the Weknisji, who controlled northern Manhattan, complained they hadn't been paid. They hadn't agreed to any sale. Their land was being occupied without compensation. Minuit found himself having to make additional payments to additional groups. The single purchase of Manhattan became multiple purchases from multiple sellers. The paper trail that was supposed to clarify ownership only created more confusion. The most famous real estate transaction in history happened on or around May 24, 1626. We don't know the exact date. We don't know the exact location. We don't have the contract. In fact, we don't have any Dutch documentation from the actual transaction. This should immediately raise questions. The Dutch were meticulous record keepers. The Dutch West India Company documented everything: cargo manifests, salary payments, military dispatches. Amsterdam's archives from this period contain millions of documents, but the deed for Manhattan? Gone. If it ever existed, what we can reconstruct comes from scattered references in later documents and the brief mention in Shagin's letter. Here's what likely happened. Peter Minuit gathered representatives of local indigenous groups, probably the Canarsie sachems, possibly others, at Fort Amsterdam. Through interpreters, he negotiated for the purchase of Manhattan Island. The Canarsie were logical negotiating partners from Minuit's perspective. They were frequently at Fort Amsterdam, trading furs and supplies. They had established relationships with Dutch traders, and they claimed some authority over Lower Manhattan. But the Canarsie primarily lived in present-day Brooklyn. Their claim to Manhattan was based on seasonal use fishing camps, oyster gathering, and occasional hunting. They may have had the right to grant the Dutch similar use rights, but did they have the authority to sell the entire island forever? Other Lenape bands certainly didn't think so. The Wekkie Fank, who had permanent villages in northern Manhattan and the Bronx, weren't party to the negotiation. Neither were the Rickawawank from eastern Manhattan or the Hackensack from across the Hudson. All these groups had legitimate claims to parts of Manhattan. It would be like someone from New Jersey selling New York City to foreign buyers. They might have some connection to the area, but hardly exclusive ownership rights. The payment itself reveals the nature of the misunderstanding. 60 guilders worth of trade goods wasn't a purchase price in the Lenape framework. It was a gift exchange establishing a relationship. In Lenape culture, important agreements were sealed with reciprocal gift-giving. The Dutch gave tools and cloth. The Lenape were permitted to share the space. The specific goods exchanged tell us something important. Iron axes, knives, and drilling awls were transformative technologies for the Lenape. A single iron axe could do the work of 20 stone axes. Metal kettles could be used directly over fire, unlike clay pots. These weren't trinkets, they were revolutionary tools. The cloth was equally valuable. European woolen cloth was warmer and more water-resistant than deer hide, and didn't require the intensive labor of skin preparation. From the Lenape perspective, they'd made an excellent deal. They'd granted the Dutch permission to maintain their fort and trading post, something that benefited the Lenape through increased trade. In exchange, they'd received tools that would improve their lives for generations, and they retained their own rights to use Manhattan. The Dutch, meanwhile, believed they'd acquired permanent sovereignty over 23 square miles of prime real estate. They thought the Lenape would now be excluded from Manhattan, except as permitted by Dutch authorities. Neither side was deliberately deceptive. They were operating from fundamentally different worldviews. For the Lenape, land was a living entity imbued with spiritual significance. It had existed before humans and would exist after. You could no more own it permanently than you could own time itself. You could have relationships with land, responsibilities to it, rights to use it, but outright ownership? The concept was absurd. For the Dutch, land was property, a commodity that could be bought, sold, divided, and passed to heirs. Ownership was exclusive and permanent. Once you bought land, it was yours forever, to do with as you pleased. These weren't just different ideas, they were mutually incomprehensible worldviews. The language barrier made things worse. The transaction was likely conducted in a mixture of broken Dutch, Munsee Lenape, and Pidgin trade languages. Complex legal concepts were reduced to simple words. Nuances were lost. Assumptions went unchallenged. Did the interpreters explain to the Lenape that this sale meant they could never fish in Manhattan's streams again without Dutch permission? Did they convey that their ancestors' graves would now be under Dutch jurisdiction? That their children would be banned from the land their families had used for centuries? Almost certainly not. Did anyone explain to Minuit that Lenape sachems couldn't unilaterally sell land? That such a decision required consensus from all affected bands? That the very concept of permanent sale foreign to Lenape culture? Definitely not. The deed, if one was created, would have been written in Dutch, a language no Lenape could read. It would have used European legal terms that had no Lenape equivalent. The sachems may have made marks on a paper they couldn't understand, thinking they were agreeing to one thing while the Dutch recorded another. Or there may never have been a formal deed at all. Schagen's letter doesn't mention one. Later, Dutch administrators seemed uncertain about the exact terms of the purchase. When disputes arose, they couldn't produce a contract. By 1630, the Dutch were making additional payments to different Lenape groups for the same land. The Wekwijsgeek demanded compensation for northern Manhattan. The Reachgoawank wanted payment for the eastern shore. Other groups claimed rights to specific valleys or streams. If Manhattan had been clearly purchased in 1626, why did the Dutch keep buying it? The answer is that the original transaction, whatever its exact nature, didn't accomplish what Minuit claimed. It was less a purchase than the beginning of a long, complex, often violent negotiation that would last decades. But Minuit had achieved his immediate goal. He could report to Amsterdam that Manhattan was purchased. The claim was established. The paperwork, such as it was filed. And history would record that Manhattan was bought for 60 guilders. The deed for Manhattan, the most important document in New York City's history, doesn't exist. It's not lost in some archive. It's not hidden in a private collection. Historians have searched for nearly 400 years. It's simply not there. This absence is extraordinary. The Dutch West India Company preserved millions of documents. We have receipts for wooden planks used to build Fort Amsterdam. We have invoices for barrels of salted pork. We have detailed correspondence about the price of beaver pelts. But the legal document transferring ownership of Manhattan Island? Nothing. The only contemporary evidence of the transaction is that single sentence in Peter Shagin's 1626 letter. 30 years later, in 1656, Dutch officials referenced the purchase in a petition stating it happened about 30 years ago. They seemed uncertain of the exact date. By the 1660s, when the English were challenging Dutch claims to New Netherland, the Dutch couldn't produce the original deed. They had to rely on testimony from elderly colonists who claimed to remember the transaction. This suggests three possibilities. The deed was lost almost immediately. It was so informal as to be meaningless, or it never existed in proper legal form. What we do have are records of subsequent purchases of Mannahatta, which raises obvious questions. If Minuit bought the island in 1626, why did the Dutch keep buying it? In 1630, Dutch records mention payments to the Wetkiskik for land in northern Manhattan. The amount: more trade goods including kettles, axes, and cloth. In 1637, the Dutch purchased land in what's now the Bronx from groups who claimed authority over parts of Manhattan. In 1639, Jonas Bronk bought land from the Rijkgouwe that may have included parts of eastern Manhattan, the same land supposedly purchased in 1626. In 1649, the Dutch made another payment to unnamed indigenous groups for confirmation of land rights on Manhattan. Each transaction suggests the original 1626 purchase was either incomplete or invalid. The Dutch were essentially buying the same land multiple times from different sellers, or from the same sellers who didn't consider the earlier sales final. Dutch colonial records reveal administrators' frustration. They complained about indigenous people who sold land, then continued using it, who demanded additional payments years later, who claimed they'd only agreed to temporary use, not permanent transfer. From the Dutch perspective, this was indigenous dishonesty. From the Lenape perspective, it was a Dutch misunderstanding. The pattern repeated across New Netherland. The Dutch would buy land, move in, then face indigenous people who insisted they retained hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. Conflicts erupted. Violence followed. Then more negotiations, more payments, more misunderstandings. Internal Dutch West India Company correspondence shows confusion about who owned what. Different administrators had different understandings of what had been purchased. Maps from the period show varying boundaries. Legal opinions contradicted each other. In 1638, Willem Kieft became Director General and tried to clarify land ownership. He demanded that indigenous groups provide proof of their authority to sell land. But how could they provide European-style documentation for indigenous-style ownership? The request was absurd. Kieft's solution was simple: assume all land was Dutch unless proved otherwise. This led directly to war. The documentation problem had real consequences. Trequa. When English settlers from Connecticut started moving into what's now Westchester, the Dutch protested, claiming they'd purchased the land. The English demanded to see the deeds. The Dutch couldn't produce clear documentation. The Lenape, watching European powers argue over paperwork for land the Lenape still considered theirs, must have found it absurd. These strangers were fighting over documents written in languages the Lenape couldn't read, describing concepts they didn't recognize, for land they'd never actually left. Some Lenape bands learned to exploit the European obsession with documentation. They would sell the same land to different European groups, Dutch, English, Swedish, collecting payment from each. When the Europeans discovered the duplicate sales, they blamed indigenous duplicity rather than their own failure to understand indigenous land concepts. The Sachemoritum of the Hakensack allegedly sold the same piece of land 3 times to different Dutch buyers, collecting payment each time. When confronted, he explained that land couldn't be sold permanently. Each transaction was for temporary use. The Dutch considered him a fraud. He probably considered them slow learners. The paper trail, or lack thereof, reveals a fundamental truth about the Manhattan Purchase. It was never a clear legal transaction even by European standards. It was the beginning of a decades-long process of dispossession accomplished through violence, disease, and gradual displacement rather than legitimate purchase. The Dutch knew this. In private correspondence, some administrators admitted uncertainty about their legal claims. But they relied on force more than law, possession more than purchase. But the myth of purchase was essential. It provided moral cover for colonization. It allowed the Dutch and later the English and Americans to claim they'd acquired Manhattan fairly. The missing deed became paradoxically more powerful for its absence. No one could examine its terms, challenge its validity, or question its authenticity. The purchase became whatever colonizers needed it to be. Today, when we say the Dutch bought Manhattan for $24, we're repeating a story based on a document that doesn't exist, describing a transaction that both parties understood differently, for a price that wasn't paid in money, from sellers who may not have had the right to sell, to buyers who kept buying the same land over and over. The paper trail doesn't lead to clarity. It leads to questions that challenge the entire foundation of Manhattan's colonial history. To understand why the Manhattan Purchase was impossible, you need to know how the Lenape saw the world. For the Lenape, the earth was their mother, Kukna, a living being that provided everything necessary for life. You don't sell your mother. You don't own her. You exist in a relationship with her, taking what you need, giving back through ceremony and careful management. Land wasn't property. It was a web of relationships stretching back to the beginning of time and forward to generations yet unborn. Every stream, hill, and forest grove had stories attached to it. Here's where ancestors were buried. That's where the deer gathered in autumn. This valley provided shelter during storms. That meadow grew the best medicinal plants. These weren't resources to be exploited, but relatives to be respected. The Lenape had a word, kikalamakwa, meaning the act of creating something good and beautiful through collective effort. This described their relationship with land, a continuous process of mutual creation. When Dutch colonists arrived, talking about buying land, the conceptual gap was unbridgeable. It would be like someone today trying to buy your family relationships or purchase your memories. The categories simply don't align. But the Lenape weren't naive. They understood territorial boundaries. Different bands had recognized hunting grounds, fishing spots, and planting fields. Conflicts over territory occurred. Negotiations between groups were common. The key difference was that these territories were defined by use, not ownership. The Canarsie might have exclusive rights to harvest oysters from certain beds during specific months. The Wetkeesgeek might control deer hunting in particular valleys during autumn. The Richgawawank might have priority access to fishing spots during spawning season. These rights overlapped in complex ways. The same piece of land might be used by different groups for different purposes at different times. This required constant negotiation, reciprocity, and respect for established patterns. When the Dutch arrived seeking land, the Lenape tried to fit them into existing frameworks. These strangers wanted a place for their trading post. Fine. The Lenape could grant them use rights, similar to how they might allow another band to fish in their waters in exchange for reciprocal access elsewhere. The 60 guilders worth of trade goods? That was a Seawood, a reciprocal gift exchange that established and maintained relationships. You gave gifts to create alliances, demonstrate respect, and ensure mutual benefit. The Dutch gave metal tools and cloth. The Lenape were permitted to share the space. From the Lenape perspective, this created obligations on both sides. The Dutch would maintain the trading post, providing access to European goods. The Lenape would continue their seasonal rounds, hunting, fishing, and gathering as they always had. Both groups would benefit from trade and mutual defense. The idea that this transaction meant the Lenape could never return to Manhattan, could never fish its streams or hunt its forests, would have been incomprehensible and insulting. It would violate every principle of reciprocity and relationship that governed their world. Many Lenape probably thought they were getting the better deal. They received invaluable tools while giving up nothing. The land was still there, they could still use it, and now they had powerful trading partners with access to remarkable goods. The metal tools alone transformed Lenape life. Tasks that took days with stone tools took hours with iron. This freed up enormous amounts of time and labor. It allowed for larger agricultural fields, more extensive construction, and increased production of trade goods like wampum. Some Lenape leaders saw the Dutch as useful allies against traditional enemies. The Mohawk to the north were aggressive and well-armed. The Susquehannock to the south were expanding their territory. Having Dutch military support, or at least the threat of it, provided security. But misunderstandings emerged quickly. The Dutch started restricting Lenape access to Manhattan. They claimed exclusive use of resources that the Lenape had always shared. They built fences across traditional paths. They killed Lenape dogs that threatened Dutch livestock. Lenape leaders complained to Dutch authorities. They hadn't agreed to exclusion. They'd agreed to share. The Dutch responded with incomprehensible talk about property rights and legal ownership. The situation deteriorated throughout the 1630s. The Dutch expanded beyond the areas the Lenape understood as agreed upon. They cleared cut forests that the Lenape needed for hunting. They dammed streams, disrupting fish runs. They let pigs run free, destroying Lenape cornfields. When the Lenape protested, the Dutch demanded that they prove their right to the land. But how could they prove something that in their worldview couldn't be owned? How could they produce documents for an oral culture? How could they explain relationships that had no Dutch equivalent? Some Lenape bands tried to adapt to Dutch legal concepts. They began demanding written agreements. They insisted on specific boundaries. They learned to use Dutch law against itself, filing complaints and petitions, but they were always at a disadvantage. The documents were in Dutch. The legal concepts were European. The authorities were colonizers. The entire system was designed to facilitate dispossession, not protect indigenous rights. By the 1640s, many Lenape had concluded that coexistence was impossible. The Dutch would never understand or respect Lenape relationships with the land. They would take everything, share nothing, and use violence to enforce their claims. This realization led directly to war. In 1643, conflict erupted that would devastate both populations, but that violence didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew from fundamental misunderstandings about what the 1626 purchase meant. For the Lenape, the Manhattan transaction was the beginning of a relationship that the Dutch repeatedly violated. For the Dutch, it was a real estate deal that the Lenape refused to honor. Neither side could bridge the conceptual gap. And in the end, Dutch guns mattered more than Lenape concepts of reciprocity. Let's talk about what 60 guilders actually meant in 1626. The famous $24 figure comes from a 19th century historian who did a crude calculation. 60 guilders in 1626 supposedly equaled $24 in 1840s American money. This number is stuck in the popular imagination, but it's wildly misleading. First, the guilder's value. In 1626, a Dutch soldier earned about 60 guilders per year, so the Manhattan payment equaled a year's military salary. A small house in Amsterdam cost 300–500 guilders. A cow costs 100 guilders. A muskalonger costs 10–15 guilders. Using modern economic equivalents is tricky, but historians estimate 60 guilders in 1626 equals anywhere from $1,000 to $15,000 in today's money, depending on whether you calculate by purchasing power, labor value, or commodity prices. But focusing on monetary value misses the point. The Lenape didn't use Dutch currency. They couldn't spend guilders. The value was in the trade goods themselves. The metal tools were revolutionary. A single iron axe was worth months of labor. Stone axe heads took days to create through patient grinding. They broke frequently. They needed constant sharpening. Iron axes lasted years, cut faster, and could be resharpened indefinitely. Consider the time savings. Clearing an acre of forest with stone tools might take a month. With iron tools, a week. Building a longhouse with stone tools required hundreds of hours of cutting and shaping. With metal tools, a fraction of that time. This efficiency gain was transformative. It allowed the Lenape to expand agriculture, increase tobacco production, and improve living standards. The 60 guilders worth of tools might have saved thousands of hours of labor, an invaluable return on investment. The cloth was equally valuable. European wool was warmer than deer hide and didn't require the intensive process of tanning. Preparing a single deer hide for use took days. Scraping, soaking, stretching, smoking, cloth just needed cutting and sewing. For the Dutch, Manhattan generated immediate profits. Within a year of the purchase, Fort Amsterdam was processing thousands of beaver pelts. Each pelt bought for 1 guilder's worth of trade goods sold in Amsterdam for 20 guilders or more. By 1630, New Netherland was shipping 10,000 pelts annually. By 1640, that number had doubled. The profits were enormous, hundreds of thousands of guilders flowing to Dutch West India Company shareholders. But the hidden costs were significant. The Dutch had to maintain Fort Amsterdam, soldiers, supplies, administrators. They had to defend against indigenous attacks and European rivals. They had to manage increasingly complex diplomatic relationships, and they had to keep buying Manhattan. Those additional payments to various Lenape groups throughout the 1630s and 1640s added up. The Dutch probably paid several hundred guilders worth of goods for Manhattan over 2 decades, far more than the original 60. Then came the wars. Kieft's War, 1643-1645, cost the Dutch West India Company hundreds of thousands of guilders. Hundreds died. Trade was disrupted. Many colonists fled back to Europe. The colony nearly collapsed. The Peach War, 1655, brought more destruction. Indigenous forces burned farms, killed colonists, and took hundreds captive. The economic losses were staggering. By 1664, when the English seized New Netherland, the Dutch had invested millions of guilders in the colony. They'd paid for Manhattan multiple times, fought multiple wars to keep it, and still couldn't establish undisputed control. The English took it without firing a shot. Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch Director General, surrendered because he knew the colonists wouldn't fight for the Dutch West India Company. The promise of profits had turned into decades of conflict and loss. So who got the better deal in 1626? In the short term, the Lenape. They received tools that improved their quality of life while maintaining access to Manhattan for decades. They continued hunting, fishing, and gathering on the island into the 1650s. They leveraged the Dutch presence for trade advantages and military alliances. The Dutch got a profitable trading post, but also endless conflict, massive expenses, and ultimately, loss of the colony to the English. In the long term, of course, the Lenape lost everything. By 1700, they'd been driven from the New York area entirely. Their population had collapsed from disease and war. Their descendants were scattered to Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and eventually Oklahoma and Wisconsin. Manhattan today is worth approximately $1.09 trillion in real estate value. Every square foot generates enormous wealth. The 60 guilders worth of trade goods wouldn't buy a cup of coffee in modern Manhattan. But that calculation assumes the 1626 transaction was legitimate. That land can be permanently transferred from one person to another through a single payment. The Dutch actually bought Manhattan rather than temporarily compensating one group for shared use. If we reject those assumptions, if we recognize that the Lenape never sold Manhattan in any meaningful sense, then talking about whether it was a good deal becomes absurd. You can't get a good deal on something that wasn't for sale. The real value of the Manhattan Purchase wasn't economic, it was ideological. It created a founding myth that justified everything that followed: the dispossession of the Lenape, the transformation of land into property, and the building of a city on what had been indigenous territory for millennia. Families fled to the fort or back to Europe. Kieft's War had backfired spectacularly. The Dutch West India Company was furious. This was supposed to be a profitable trading colony, not a war zone. They sent reinforcements, not to expand the war, but to end it. Captain John Underhill, an English mercenary who'd participated in the Pequot War's Mystic Massacre, was hired. He brought tactics learned in New England. Total war against indigenous communities. In 1644, Underhill led 130 soldiers in attacks on Lenape villages. They burned longhouses with families inside, shot anyone who fled. destroyed food stores. At one village near present-day Westchester, between 500 and 700 Lenape were killed in a single night. Underhill later wrote that the ground was so covered with blood that it seemed a sea of blood. By 1645, the Lenape were exhausted. Perhaps 1,600 had been killed from bands that numbered only a few thousand total. Their crops were destroyed. Their villages burned. They couldn't sustain the war. Peace was negotiated. The Lenape agreed to stay away from Dutch settlements. The Dutch agreed too. Couldn't. Nothing really. They'd won. But winning meant they destroyed their own economy. The fur trade collapsed. Dead and displaced indigenous people couldn't trap beavers. Farms remained abandoned. Colonists were too terrified to return. The colony hemorrhaged money. Kieft was recalled to the Netherlands in disgrace. His ship sank off Wales. He drowned, taking his records with him. Peter Stuyvesant replaced him in 1647. He tried to stabilize relations, but the damage was done. The Lenape would never trust the Dutch again. More violence erupted in 1655. The Peach War, triggered by a Dutch farmer shooting a Lenape woman for picking peaches. 600 warriors attacked New Amsterdam, burned farms, and took 150 hostages. By 1664, when the English seized New Netherland without firing a shot, the Lenape population around Manhattan had collapsed. Disease, war, and displacement had reduced thousands to hundreds. The survivors had three choices: submit to European rule, flee west, or die fighting. Most fled. They moved inland, joining other tribes, losing their specific identity as Manhattan's inhabitants. The Purchase of 1626 had provided legal cover for conquest. The Dutch could tell themselves, and European courts, that they bought the land fairly. The violence that followed was just defending their property. But the Lenape knew the truth. They'd never sold Manhattan. They'd agreed to share it, and for that, they'd been slaughtered. The story of Manhattan's purchase for $24 worth of beads isn't just wrong. It's a carefully constructed lie that served specific political purposes for centuries. The myth began with Washington Irving. In 1809, Irving published A History of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty, under the pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker. It was satire, deliberately absurd, mocking both Dutch colonists and indigenous peoples with equal cruelty. Irving described the purchase as 60 guilders worth of goods, but portrayed the Lenape as primitive fools entranced by beads, brass rings, and other jewels. He invented dialogue, fabricated details, and turned history into farce. He was joking. His readers knew he was joking, but the joke became history. By the mid-1800s, historians were citing Irving as a source. The satirical became factual. The insult became accepted. The conversion to $24 came later. In 1846, a historian calculated that 60 guilders in 1626 would equal $24 in contemporary American money. This was terrible economics. It ignored purchasing power, inflation, and the actual value of trade goods to the Lenape. But $24 sounded perfectly pathetic. It reinforced what white Americans wanted to believe. Indigenous people were childlike primitives who traded away fortunes for shiny trinkets. The myth evolved through repetition. Each telling made it worse. 60 guilders became $24. Trade goods became beads. A complex negotiation became a simple swindle. The Lenape became generic Indians. By 1900, every American schoolchild knew that Manhattan was bought for $24 worth of beads from foolish Indians who didn't understand value. The myth served manifest destiny perfectly. If indigenous peoples were too naive to value land, then taking it wasn't theft, it was destiny. If they sold Manhattan for beads, they deserved to lose everything else. The story justified every broken treaty, every forced removal, every acre stolen. After all, Indians had been giving away valuable land for worthless trinkets since Manhattan. It was their nature. The truth that the Lenape had different concepts of land use, that they believed they were entering a sharing agreement, that they were later slaughtered for the land they'd never intended to sell, disappeared entirely. Even the Dutch disappear from the popular version. The focus becomes indigenous stupidity, not European deception. The Lenape became the authors of their own dispossession. This wasn't accidental. It was propaganda. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, as America grappled with its genocidal treatment of indigenous peoples, the Manhattan myth provided comfort. See, we didn't steal the country, they sold it for $24. Their fault? Not ours. The myth appeared in textbooks, newspapers, and popular history. Mark Twain referenced it. It became a standard joke. "I've got a bridge to sell you" stems partly from the idea that anyone could trick Indians into selling valuable property. Hollywood amplified it. Movies showed primitive natives dazzled by beads and mirrors, eagerly trading away their birthright. The myth became visual, visceral, true. Even today, tour guides in Manhattan repeat it. $24 worth of beads, they say, as if it's amusing. Tourists laugh, take photos, buy souvenirs commemorating history's greatest real estate deal. The actual documentation, a single line in a 1626 letter mentioning 60 guilders, is never examined. The complexity of Lenape society is never explained. The subsequent genocide is never mentioned, because the myth is too useful to abandon. It tells Americans what they want to hear, that the country was destined to be theirs, that indigenous peoples were obstacles, not owners, that conquest was actually commerce. Modern historians have thoroughly debunked every element. We know 60 guilders wasn't $24. $24. We know the payment in beads, but metal tools and cloth. We know the Lenape didn't think they were selling land forever. We know multiple groups claimed Manhattan and received multiple payments. But the myth persists because it's simpler than the truth. Truth requires acknowledging that Manhattan was stolen through violence, not purchased through trade. Truth requires recognizing indigenous peoples as sophisticated political actors, not naive primitives. Truth requires admitting that America's greatest city is built on blood and lies. Much easier to say $24 worth of beads and move on. The Lenape descendants know better. Split between Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Ontario, and small communities in the Northeast, they maintain oral histories that preserve the truth. They know their ancestors weren't fools. They know the sale was a misunderstanding at best, fraud at worst. They know what was really stolen wasn't purchased but taken through massacre and displacement, but their voices are rarely heard over the myth. In 2013, the Lenape Center was founded in New York City to preserve and share Lenape culture and history. They work to correct the record, educate the public, and reconnect Lenape people with their homeland. They face an uphill battle. The $24 worth of beads story is embedded in American consciousness. It's on postcards, in guidebooks, in every lazy historical summary of New York. Breaking a myth this useful, this comfortable, this entrenched requires more than facts. It requires Americans to question fundamental narratives about their nation's founding. It requires asking, if they lied about Manhattan, what else did they lie about? The answer is almost everything involving indigenous peoples and land. Manhattan wasn't bought for $24 worth of beads. It was stolen through violence and justified through mythology. Yeah, the real transaction wasn't between the Dutch and the Lenape in 1626. It was between American mythology and American conscience, trading comfortable lies for uncomfortable truths. And unlike the Lenape, Americans knew exactly what they were selling. Let's talk about value. Manhattan today is worth approximately $1.09 trillion. That's trillion with a T. The land alone, not the buildings, not the businesses, just the dirt, is valued at over $1.74 trillion. Central Park, $1 trillion. Times Square, 1 square foot sells for $2,000. The entire island, 13,000 acres that generate more wealth than most entire nations. So who got cheated in 1626? The simple answer seems obvious. The Lenape. They sold Manhattan for and lost everything. But the simple answer is wrong. First, the Lenape got exactly what they wanted from the 1626 transaction. Metal tools that revolutionized their work. Cloth that protected against winter. Items that would have taken months of labor to produce traditionally. They didn't think they were selling Manhattan forever. They thought they were entering a trade relationship, granting use rights, creating an alliance. From their perspective, the Dutch were paying tribute to use Lenape land. A perfectly reasonable arrangement. And they kept collecting payments. The historical record shows multiple additional sales of Manhattan, 1630. The Dutch pay the Canarsie again, 1639. Payment to the Wekkie, 1649. Another payment for the same land, 1669. The English pay various groups for lands already purchased. The Lenape weren't fooled once. They collected payment repeatedly for the same territory, playing different European groups against each other. If anyone got cheated initially, it was the Dutch, paying multiple times for land they thought they'd already bought. But then, violence changed everything. After Kieft's war, after the massacres, after the displacement, the Lenape lost not just Manhattan, but their entire world. They were pushed west, scattered and decimated by disease and warfare. That's the real theft. Not the 1626 transaction, but the genocide that followed. The Dutch? They controlled Manhattan for only 38 years. In 1664, English warships appeared in the harbor. Peter Stuyvesant wanted to fight. The colonists, exhausted by Indigenous wars and company mismanagement, refused. New Amsterdam became New York without a shot being fired. The Dutch got 38 years of profit from Manhattan. Millions of guilders in fur trade revenue, true, but also enormous costs. Defending the colony, maintaining it, losing colonists to warfare. The Dutch West India Company went bankrupt in 1674, partly due to New Netherlands expenses. They hardly won Manhattan. The English took over and held it for another century, making fortunes from trade. Then it was lost in the American Revolution. Every owner of Manhattan profited temporarily, then lost control, except one group, the white Americans who inherited it from 1783 onward. They're the ones who turned Manhattan into the world's financial capital. They built the skyscrapers, the stock exchange, and the center of global capitalism. They profited not from the 1626 purchase, but from the violence that cleared the Lenape away. Today, the Lenape diaspora numbers about 16,000 people scattered across North America, Delaware Nation in Oklahoma, 15,500 Stockbridge Munsee in Wisconsin, 1,500 Delaware Nation at Moravian Town in Ontario. 0 small unrecognized communities in the Northeast combined net worth of all Lenape communities, perhaps $500 million, mostly from casinos and federal settlements. Manhattan's daily economic output, $2.05 billion. The island generates more wealth in one day than all the Lenape people collectively possess. But wealth isn't the only measure of loss. The Lenape lost their sacred sites. Collect Pond, where they gathered for ceremonies, is buried under downtown Manhattan. Their fishing camps are under Wall Street. Their burial grounds are under skyscrapers. They lost their language. Only a handful of fluent Lenape speakers remain, most elderly. The Manhattan dialect is completely extinct. They lost their homeland. Many Lenape have never seen Manhattan. Others visit as tourists to a place their ancestors inhabited for 10,000 years. In 2009, some reconciliation began. The National Museum of the American Indian opened in New York. Lenape representatives were invited to celebrations of Henry Hudson's voyage, small acknowledgments, but no land back, no reparations, no real recognition that Manhattan was stolen, not sold. The High Line Park includes a small plaque acknowledging the Lenape presence. Wall Street has no memorial to the villages destroyed. The Met Museum displays indigenous artifacts, but not indigenous sovereignty. Every year, millions of tourists visit Manhattan. They buy I Love NY shirts made in China. They take photos at Times Square built on Wequisgeek land. They walk through Central Park, designed on Lenape hunting grounds. No one learned the real story. So who got cheated? The Lenape lost a homeland. The Dutch lost an empire. The English lost a colony. But modern Americans, they inherited a stolen island that generates trillions, built on a genocide they've forgotten, justified by a myth about $24 in beads. They got Manhattan for nothing. Not 60 guilders, not $24, nothing. Because they weren't part of any transaction. They just took what violence had cleared and mythology had justified. The real lesson of Manhattan's purchase isn't about the price. It's about how conquest becomes commerce and historical memory, how theft becomes a deal, how genocide becomes a real estate joke. Today, land acknowledgements sometimes begin events in New York. We acknowledge this is Lenape land. Acknowledgement without action is just words. The Lenape can't get Manhattan back. That's impossible. But they deserve the truth to be told. Their real history is off. Their surviving communities are supported. Their existence in the present, not just the past, is recognized, because they're still here. The people who supposedly sold Manhattan for $24 worth of beads, they survived conquest, genocide, removal, and erasure. That's worth more than $1.9 trillion. That's priceless.